Welcome to another edition of Carnivore Bites. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, along with Dr. Eric Lopkin. And it's convention time. The Democrats had their convention. And obviously, former Vice President Trump selected Kamala Harris as his running mate.
Vice President Biden.
What did I say?
You said Vice President Trump.
Don't worry. It happens to the best of them, especially when you get old. Yes, Vice President Biden, my bad, selected Kamala Harris as his running mate. The convention happened. It was a, let's just say, less than an upbeat convention. No bump. Your analysis, Dr. Lopkin.
Yeah, it's very surprising when a convention comes on either side and there's no bump for the candidate. Now, I'm actually going to credit a lot of this to the fact that it was a virtual convention. So there were no crowds cheering the speeches. The speeches were pre-recorded. It was overall an incredibly dull convention. And I think that accounts for a lot of it, but not all.
So is the Republican convention. And I know they have some audience. I think the production value of the Democratic convention was awful, but I think the content was too, wasn't it, Dr. Lopkin?
The content was a big problem because if you listen to all of their speeches, there were no issues discussed. There was no plan in place. It was all, we have to beat Donald Trump. Donald Trump is bad. Well,
evil, yes.
You're basically, I mean, granted, a convention, you're preaching to the converted already, but there were a lot of people who were very disappointed in the fact that they had no platform. And it was amazing how many celebrities. Now, let's face it, these celebrities are usually diehard Democrats, and certainly the ones I'm talking about are. But you had Stephen Colbert come out and rail against Clinton's speech. You had Ice Cube, who is a big celebrity leader of Black Lives Matter, go off on how the Democrats were condescending to the African-American community and how dare they just assume that they're going to vote Democrat. You had Rose McGowan, who was a big, she was one of the ones that started the Me Too movement. She was going off on how can we put up Joe Biden as our Democrat and still say we're defending women's rights. So they lost a lot of credibility.
Well, also, and I think couldn't it be, if you use a football analogy, was at one time a big football fan. I always used to watch when they played prevent defense. You're up by 10 points. 80% of the time, it backfired and the other team would come back. Hasn't Biden played prevent defense the entire time? And isn't that maybe an ill-gotten strategy?
Prevent defense is usually a bad strategy. And to a certain extent, yes, that's what the Democrats are doing because they're not fighting on issues. They're fighting on Trump bad. We have to get rid of Trump. And they're not really giving any reasons. I mean, the fact of the matter is prior to COVID, the economy was going gangbusters. And a lot of what's going
have, but the only issue they have is really COVID, isn't it? And Trump's, I don't think he did the best job in managing it.
Well, he didn't do the best job in managing it, but they're not even focusing on that. They'll touch on that, but they're trying to make this a campaign about character. Now, granted, this is Trump's weak spot, so I understand why they're doing it. The problem is they put up a candidate who has the same character as Trump does. So
Zero.
This is,
yes.
And it was pointed out in a couple of places, Biden ran for president previously and had to drop out because he plagiarized a speech. A number of people pointed out the fact that his acceptance speech at the convention was also plagiarized. So he hasn't even learned his lesson.
No, it's totally amazing. What I'm really amazed at is the difference in the two conventions. And I was thinking that Trump's goose might have been cook or cooking, and the polls have closed. I didn't watch, it in entirety, but I've seen the first two nights on and off, and it's a much better done than the Democratic and convention. And I think Trump's going to get a little boost, a little bump, which Biden didn't. And I really believe, as the polls are reflecting, that it's a close race now, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, it was always a close race, certainly closer than the poll would indicate. The one thing I did love about the Democratic convention was that Hillary Clinton came out and said, remember, Biden can win by 3 million points and still lose the presidency.
Yes. Well, she's come across as someone that just her time is stop it already. She's just never got over it. I don't like to play amateur psychologist. I think she's never gotten over her loss, and she's bitter and just can't deal with it.
Well, she clearly never got over the loss, but to be fair, neither did most of the Democrats. I mean, that's what
True.
The impeachment hearings were all about. They went after Trump before he ever took office.
Yeah, and that's something that I wasn't thinking of, but maybe real quick, is there any legs to the whole investigation with Biden with Obama, and Biden too, in terms of the surveillance, or do you think that's kind of that ship has sailed?
Well, results actually came in on that. And of course, the media doesn't bother talking about it. But the investigation by the AG's office found a tremendous amount of anti-Trump bias in the FBI during the election. And they found that they were doing things with Clinton that they did not give Trump the chance. They focused on Russia trying to help Trump. The investigation showed that China was trying to help Clinton. But the FBI told Clinton about this and gave her the opportunity to get away from the Chinese influence. They never did that with Russia and Trump, despite the fact that they are actually required to do that by law. I just learned all about this just recently. So you had the exact same situation. Hillary, they gave the chance to get out of it. Trump, they tried to use to nail him.
To the main office. Thank you.
Yes. Sorry for that interruption, but you're in the studio. One last fact that I think is really interesting. You're talking about independence, Dr. Lopkin. Can you talk a little bit about that? I was really amazed that you were saying what you were saying, and also the Democratic and Republican in terms of their enthusiasm or likability to the candidates.
Yeah, this was a CBS News poll that just came out. It was done, I believe, last week. So I don't think it reflects the conventions, but it does reflect Kamala Harris being named vice president. Republican and Democrats that they spoke to overwhelmingly are going to support their candidate. I think it was something like 95% of Republicans are pro-Trump, 97% of Democrats are pro-Biden. Remember, however, that these are, we've seen that these polls are not terribly accurate and they tend to swing to the left. What struck me, though, was the poll of unaffiliated independent voters. And in independent voters, Trump has a 10-point lead on Biden.
Well, that's that. If I was in the Biden camp, I'd be rather concerned with that because independents are what sways an election, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is the group that sways the election. And the fact that independents right now are that far ahead with Trump is really surprising, because I would have expected at this point in the campaign for it to be much closer to 50-50.
So would I. There's no question.
The fact that Trump has a 10-point lead with that group, honestly, I believe says more about their mistrust of Biden and the fact that they don't like Biden more than the fact that they like Trump.
I would agree with that. And two other things, just real quick before we need to exit this broadcast, this segment. I think it's two things. I think it's Biden's unlikability, the radical nature of the Democratic platform, which is shocking, and the riots. Just real quick summarize on that.
I believe all of those are factors. When you take a look at riots historically, elections that follow riots tend to swing to the right. You had the Watts riot, you had Ronald Reagan elected governor. You had the riots in the 60s, you had Richard Nixon elected president. This is something that happens especially with independent voters. So I do think the riots are swinging more voters towards Trump. Certainly, Biden is an underwhelming candidate. So that's one of the reasons the Democrats are focusing on, well, Trump is a horrible candidate, because they have to focus away from the fact that so is Biden. But I honestly think a big part of this is Kamala Harris, because you had African Americans coming out and saying they are not going to support her. And that's the group that, the Democrats thought Harris was going to bring them. Again, you've got, a split in the Me Too movement. So you've got half of them that are gung-ho for Biden and half of them refuse to support him. So I think the divisiveness of the Democratic ticket is what's giving Trump his lead.
I would agree with that. I agree 100% with that. I think it's a much more interesting story than I initially thought in terms of even like 3 weeks ago, a month ago. I actually will close on this. I give Trump 60%. What do you think?
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. I've got him handicapped at a 60% chance of winning the race. And I think it is interesting because we've said this over and over again, but had the Democrats chosen a better candidate, the one we always use as an example is Amy Klobuchar. Had they backed her, had they backed a better candidate, I honestly believe they would have had no problem beating Trump. But now Trump's got a 60-40 lead in the handicapping.
Agreed. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lopkin, and thank all our listeners for tuning in. And we'll be live on Friday at 4 o'clock. We have Dr. Gilbert, a psychologist, and also involved in a lot of emotional stability issues, which will address a lot of what's going on in the economy in terms of people's reaction and the ongoing pandemic. Thank you, Dr. Lopkin.
And you can listen to that live Friday at 4 at blogtalkradio.com/Carnivore Radio. See you then. You've been listening to Carnivore Bites, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch us every week on carnivoreradio.com, exvadio.com/podcasts, the Apple Podcast Store, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever you find podcasts.